Maybe you are not tired because God has done nothing. Maybe you are tired because you've been faithful for so long that now the silence feels heavier than the battle ever did. Maybe you have already had your Mount Carmel moment. Maybe you have already prayed, already obeyed, already stood when it would have been easier to quit. Maybe you have already watched God move in a way you knew was real. And yet somehow, after all of that, you still woke up carrying fear, confusion, and a sadness you cannot fully explain. That is a different kind of pain. It is one thing to struggle before the miracle. It is another thing to struggle after it. It is one thing to believe God can do something. It is another thing to watch Him do it and still end up in a place where your soul feels empty. And that is why the story of Elijah matters so deeply, because Elijah is often remembered as the prophet of fire. The man who shut the heavens, the man who confronted kings, the man who stood alone against the prophets of Baal, the man who prayed and watched heaven answer in front of an entire nation. But that is not the whole story. The deeper part of Elijah's story is not just that he was strong enough to call down fire. It is that after the fire fell, after the people bowed, after the victory everyone would have called undeniable, he still broke in the wilderness and asked God to let him die. And maybe that is exactly where this meets you, because sometimes the greatest crisis of faith does not happen when you have seen nothing. Sometimes it happens after you have seen enough to know God is real, but your life still hurts in places you thought that victory would heal. Sometimes the breaking point is not before the breakthrough. Sometimes it comes after, and if you do not understand that, you may start reading your season the wrong way. You may think your exhaustion means your faith is failing. You may think your weakness means the calling is over. You may think your silence means heaven has stepped back. You may think the fact that you are still hurting after obedience means none of it mattered. But what if the silence is not proof of abandonment? What if the place that feels empty is not empty at all? What if the season you are in right now is not the collapse of God's work in you, but the place where He is doing something deeper than fire from heaven could ever accomplish? That is where Elijah's story turns. And if you stay with it long enough, it may change the way you read your own life. Israel did not fall in a single moment. That is important. Nations rarely collapse all at once. Hearts rarely drift all at once. People do not usually wake up one morning and decide to abandon everything holy. Most of the time, the fall is slower than that, quieter than that, more gradual than that. A small compromise here, a little accommodation there. One generation loosens what the previous generation guarded. What once felt unthinkable starts feeling normal. What once would have grieved the conscience begins to sound practical. And over time, the soul adjusts to what it should have resisted. That is what happened in Israel. The covenant people did not lose their identity overnight. They eroded it. They absorbed the values around them. They learned how to keep the language of faith while slowly surrendering the substance of it. They lived near altars and far from surrender. They kept the name of God in their mouths while giving their trust to other powers. And that is always more dangerous than open rebellion, because open rebellion at least admits what it is. Compromise hides behind familiarity. It lets people believe they are fine while they are drifting. It lets them hold pieces of obedience and call that whole devotion. It lets them blend what God has spoken with what culture rewards, and by the time the consequences arrive, they no longer know how far they have gone. By the time Ahab became king, the decay was no longer subtle. Scripture does not present him as merely flawed. It presents him as a king who intensified evil, a man who did not just inherit spiritual decline but helped deepen it. And one of the clearest ways he did that was through alliance. He married Jezebel. That decision was not merely political, it was spiritual. It was not just a union between kingdoms. It was an opening of the gates. Jezebel came from Sidon, carrying with her the worship of Baal and Asherah, not as private preferences, but as active systems of devotion, power, and influence. She did not arrive content to add one more religious option to Israel's landscape. She came with zeal, she came with force, she came with the kind of certainty that does not coexist peacefully with truth. Soon the land was no longer just confused. It was being restructured. Altars dedicated to the Lord were torn down. False worship was strengthened. Prophets of the Lord were hunted. Voices that once called the nation back to covenant had to hide in caves just to stay alive. And what makes that so sobering is that the people did not all resist. Many adapted, because when pressure rises, many people choose what helps them survive socially, not what keeps them faithful spiritually. When truth becomes costly, compromise begins to look reasonable. And if you are not careful, you start calling survival wisdom when it is actually surrender. Maybe you know what that feels like. Not the exact political situation. Not the literal prophets in caves, but the pressure, the confusion, the exhaustion of trying to stay faithful in an environment where faithfulness feels outnumbered. Maybe you know what it is to live in a world where conviction starts sounding extreme and compromise starts sounding mature. Maybe you know what it is to feel like the values you are trying to hold are being laughed at, diluted, or pushed to the margins. Maybe you know what it is to keep praying in a culture that keeps teaching you to trust what God never asked you to trust. And if that is where you are, then you understand at least part of the darkness Elijah walked into. Because Elijah did not arrive at a healthy nation needing a small adjustment. He arrived at a spiritually fractured people who had forgotten who they were. And into that kind of confusion, God sent a man from the wilderness. No long introduction, no polished credentials, no gradual rise. Elijah appears suddenly, almost like a storm no one saw forming. One moment, Ahab is in his palace, surrounded by the machinery of power, protected by royal assumption, living as if God's silence means God's weakness. The next moment, Elijah is standing there before him with a message that cuts through every illusion in the room. There will be no dew and no rain except that the word God gives through him. That declaration was not random. It struck directly at Baal's supposed domain. Baal was worshipped as a storm god, a fertility god, a source of rain, harvest, and agricultural life. So Elijah's prophecy was not just about weather, it was about exposure. It was God confronting the lie at the center of the nation's worship. You think this false god controls abundance? Then watch what happens when the sky closes. You think prosperity comes from the altars you built with compromise? Then see what remains when those altars cannot bring one drop from heaven. The drought was judgment. Yes, but it was also revelation. Because sometimes God allows the false thing you leaned on to fail so clearly that you can no longer pretend it ever held you. Sometimes mercy looks like exposure. Sometimes love looks like the collapse of what was deceiving you. Sometimes the drought is not just punishment. Sometimes it is the stripping away of illusion, and then Elijah disappears. That matters too. He speaks one thunderous word before a king, and then God sends him away from the public stage to Cherith, to a brook, to isolation. That is a hard shift. Imagine the adrenaline of confronting power. Imagine speaking with authority that makes a palace go silent. Imagine being the man through whom heaven announces a national crisis. And then, almost immediately, you are hidden. No audience, no visible influence, no platform, no applause, No sign that the kingdom changed because of what you said. Just a ravine, a stream and ravens. God fed Elijah in the hidden place, not through dignified means, not through systems that made sense. Through ravens, unclean birds, scavengers, creatures associated with desolation more than comfort. Morning and evening they brought him bread and meat. And it is hard not to feel the humility of that scene. The man who stood before a king now waits for birds. The prophet whose words shut the heavens now drinks from a brook that will eventually dry because of the very judgment he announced. The public authority is real, but so is the private dependence. And maybe that is something you need to hear, because many people love the idea of being used by God in powerful ways. But far fewer are prepared for the hidden seasons that often follow obedience. Far fewer are prepared for the places where there is no visible influence, no emotional reward, no obvious progress, just daily dependence. And yet, that is where God often does his deepest preparation. At Cherith, Elijah was not learning how to call down fire. He was learning how to be sustained when nothing looked impressive. He was learning that the God who uses you publicly must also be trusted privately, that the God who gives bold words in front of kings must still be trusted when the only sign of provision is a bird arriving at the right time. That dependence is not a lesser form of faith than confrontation. In some seasons it is the greater one because it takes courage to stand before Ahab, but it also takes courage to remain hidden when your flesh wants movement. It takes strength to confront false prophets, but it also takes strength to accept daily bread without demanding tomorrow's guarantee. And then the brook dries up. Of course it does. That is part of the tension. God's protection did not exempt Elijah from the effects of the drought. The judgment that fell on the land touched the prophet too. The one who announced the word still had to live inside its consequences. That is sobering and strangely comforting, because some people imagine that if they are truly in God's will, difficulty will somehow move around them. That obedience should purchase immunity, that calling should remove discomfort. But Elijah's story does not support that. He was in the center of God's instruction and still felt the pressure of the season. And maybe you are there now. Maybe you obeyed, and the brook still dried. Maybe you trusted, and the resources still narrowed. Maybe you followed, and the path still became harder than you expected. That does not automatically mean you missed God. Sometimes the brook dries not because God has left, but because he is moving you. Sometimes the end of one provision is the beginning of another lesson. Sometimes when what sustained you yesterday is no longer enough. Heaven is not punishing you. It is redirecting you. Then God tells Elijah to go to Zarephath. That should sound surprising. God sends his prophet into Sidon, into the region associated with Jezebel, into enemy territory, into a place where Baal worship would have been deeply familiar. And there, Elijah is told, a widow will provide for him. Again, notice how strange God's methods are. A widow was already vulnerable. A widow in a drought was in crisis. This is not the person human logic would identify as a stable source of provision. But God often sends his people to the kind of places that force them to stop trusting appearances. He often hides provision in what looks weak. He often places life inside situations that look nearly empty. He often chooses means that make it impossible for you to confuse his faithfulness with human security. Elijah arrives and finds the widow gathering sticks. That image is painfully simple. No abundance, no strength, no evidence of turnaround. Just a woman at the edge of survival. She tells him the truth. She has only a little flour and a little oil left. She is preparing one final meal for herself and her son. After that, she expects death, And then Elijah asks for bread, not after she and her son eat first. That is one of those moments in Scripture that can sound almost unbearable if you do not sit with it honestly. This was not a comfortable request. It demanded trust from someone who had very little left to offer and even less reason to feel secure. But Elijah also gives her a promise. The flour will not run out, the oil will not fail, not until the Lord sends rain again. The widow has every reason to protect what remains. Every instinct would tell her to preserve the last little portion for her child. Every fear would tell her that strangers cannot be trusted, and promises do not fill empty stomachs. But she responds in faith, and that is remarkable, not because she had certainty. She did not because the circumstances improved first. They did not because the math finally made sense. It did not. She responded while still looking at lack. And that is what faith often looks like in real life. Not certainty before obedience, obedience before certainty, not because the fear is gone, because the word matters more than the fear. The jar and the jug do not become warehouses. God does not flood the house with obvious excess. Instead, He sustains them day by day, and that is a miracle many people underestimate, because dramatic miracles are easy to admire. It does not always feel spectacular. It does not create the same emotional rush. It does not always give you a story you can tell in one sentence. But to wake up each day in a season of scarcity and still find enough for that day, that is holy too. That is mercy too. That is God too. Maybe you are in a season like that now, not overflowing, not thriving by the standards people like to display, not standing in some obvious breakthrough, just being sustained quietly daily, enough for this day, enough grace for this hour, enough strength to keep walking, enough mercy to keep breathing. Do not despise that kind of miracle. There are seasons where God does not give you abundance in advance because He is teaching you how to know Him in daily dependence. There are seasons where the miracle is not that your life suddenly feels easy. The miracle is that you have not run out yet. The miracle is that peace keeps appearing where panic should have consumed you. The miracle is that your heart is still tender after everything it has been through. The miracle is that somehow, in ways you cannot fully explain, you are still here. And yet even in that house, death enters. This is where the story becomes painfully human. The widow's son gets sick, then worse, then he dies. And now the house that has been sustained by miraculous provision becomes the house of unbearable grief. That is hard because many people can process suffering before they see God move. What is harder to process is suffering after He has moved. Pain that comes into a place where His faithfulness has already been seen. Loss in the middle of provision, grief under a roof where flour has not run out. That kind of pain can shake people deeply because it confuses the categories. The widow had watched the jar hold. She had watched the oil remain. She had real evidence that God had visited her home. And yet now her son is gone, so she turns to Elijah with accusation born from heartbreak. Why are you here? Why has this happened? Has your presence exposed me? Has God remembered my sin, only to judge me through my child? Her grief interprets the loss as punishment. That is what pain often does when it is raw enough. It reaches for explanation before healing. It wants to make sense of suffering quickly. It often assumes the worst because the wound feels too deep to leave unanswered. Maybe you know that feeling too. Maybe something in your life broke in a season where you thought God had already proven His faithfulness. And because of that, the pain felt even more confusing. Maybe you looked at heaven and thought, I know you were with me before. So why does this hurt so much now? Maybe you wondered whether some hidden flaw in you was the reason everything suddenly got dark. Maybe you started interpreting the wound as judgment because it felt easier than sitting in the mystery. Elijah does not offer the widow a polished theological explanation. He takes the boy upstairs, he lays him on the bed, and he cries out to God. That matters, because the prophet does not stand there pretending the moment is simple. He does not move in cold detachment. He wrestles, he pleads. He brings confusion directly into prayer. Sometimes the most honest faith is not neat. Sometimes it is a cry. Sometimes it is a question you bring to God without pretending you already know the answer. Sometimes it is your refusal to walk away while still admitting that your heart does not understand what heaven is allowing. Elijah stretches himself over the child and asks for life to return. Again and again, and God hears him. The boy lives. Elijah carries him downstairs and gives him back to his mother. And now her confession changes. Now she knows. Now she recognizes that the word of the Lord in Elijah's mouth is true. But notice this carefully. Her deepest certainty does not emerge only from provision. It emerges after provision has been tested by grief and still held under the power of God. That is deeper faith, not the faith that only survives when the miracle is easy to read. And the faith that survives when pain enters the miracle and God still proves himself. And perhaps that is one reason some seasons feel so severe. Because God is not merely trying to impress you with his power. He is forming something in you that will know him at a depth comfort alone could never produce. 3 years pass, 3 long years of drought. That is not a short waiting season. That is not an afternoon of inconvenience. That is prolonged pressure, prolonged judgment, prolonged tension, long enough for the land to feel the cost, long enough for weakness to be exposed, long enough for the people to understand that what they trusted cannot save them. Then at last, God tells Elijah to go back. Show yourself to Ahab. The drought is nearing its turning point, but before rain comes, something else must happen before the skies open. The illusion must be confronted publicly. Elijah meets Obadiah first, a man inside Ahab's household who still fears the Lord. That detail matters because it shows again that even in corrupt systems, God preserves hidden faithfulness. The remnant is not always loud. Sometimes it survives quietly in difficult places. Sometimes the most faithful people are not the most visible people. Sometimes they are simply the ones who did not bow internally, even while living under pressure externally. Obadiah is afraid, and understandably so. Ahab has been searching for Elijah everywhere. The king blames the prophet for troubling Israel, as people often blame the messenger for the consequences of the truth they resisted. When Ahab finally sees Elijah, he does not greet him with repentance. He says in effect, "So here is the troubler of Israel." And Elijah answers with clarity, "I have not troubled Israel. You have, you and your father's house, by forsaking the commands of the Lord and following Baal." That is a strong moment, because corruption always prefers to blame the person who names it. Deception always resents exposure. The system that drifts from God often labels the truthful voice as disruptive, simply because truth makes comfort impossible. Maybe you have felt that maybe you were not trying to be dramatic, you were just trying to be honest. Maybe you were not trying to create tension. You were just refusing to lie about what mattered. Maybe you were called difficult, intense, or troublesome simply because you would not pretend darkness was light. If so, Elijah understands more than you think. Then comes Carmel, one mountain, one altar, one nation watching, hundreds of false prophets. One lonely prophet of the Lord. This is one of the most dramatic scenes in all of Scripture. But what makes it powerful is not just the spectacle. It is the exposure of divided hearts. Elijah's first challenge is not even aimed at the prophets of Baal. It is aimed at the people. How long will you limp between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. That question cuts, because divided loyalty exhausts the soul. Trying to keep one foot in truth and one foot in compromise will tear a person apart. Trying to honor God while still bowing to whatever your culture says will keep you unstable. Trying to preserve faith without full surrender produces inner fracture. And maybe some of your exhaustion comes from there. Not just from waiting, from limping, from trying to stay close enough to God to feel safe while still holding on to what He already told you to release. From wanting the peace of obedience without the cost of wholeheartedness. The people do not answer. Silence. That silence is telling. Because when a heart has been divided too long, clarity starts feeling dangerous. Decision starts feeling costly. Many people prefer vague spirituality to clear surrender, because surrender removes the comfort of double-mindedness. So Elijah proposes the test. 2 bulls, 2 altars, no fire. The God who answers by fire. He is God. The people agree. The prophets of Baal go first. Morning begins. The altar is prepared. The sacrifice is laid out. And they begin to cry, hour after hour. Voices raised, bodies moving, ritual intensified, desperation growing. But nothing happens. No voice, no answer, no fire. By noon, Elijah begins to mock them. Cry louder. Maybe your God is deep in thought. Maybe he is busy. Maybe he has gone on a journey. Maybe he is asleep and needs to be awakened. There is something sharp in that, almost uncomfortable, but it reveals something important. False gods always demand more and give less. They exhaust their worshippers. They create frenzy instead of peace. They demand performance, volume, and injury, yet cannot answer the deepest human need. So the prophets cry louder. They cut themselves. Blood runs down their bodies. The scene becomes more violent, more frantic, more desperate. Still nothing. That is what idolatry does in the end. It takes from you. It wounds you. It promises response and leaves you bleeding. Then Elijah steps forward, and what he does first is deeply significant. He repairs the altar of the Lord. The altar had been broken down. That is not just a construction detail. It is a spiritual picture. Before fire falls, something broken must be restored. Before the nation can witness God's answer, the place of covenant must be rebuilt. He uses 12 stones, according to the tribes of Israel. 12. Even though the kingdom is divided, even though the nation is fractured politically and spiritually, Elijah still builds with the memory of who they were meant to be under God. Shout ye will under God. He builds according to covenant identity, not current confusion. And maybe that matters for you too, because when God begins restoring your life, He does not rebuild around your confusion. He rebuilds around His original intention. He rebuilds according to truth, not drift. He does not call you what your compromise has made you. He calls you according to the covenant He still remembers. Elijah arranges the wood, places the sacrifice, builds a trench, and then he does something that seems almost reckless. He tells them to pour water on and everything, not once, 3 times. Water runs over the offering, over the wood, over the altar. It fills the trench. Why? Because God is about to answer in a way no one can explain away. Sometimes heaven allows the impossibility to become more obvious before the answer comes. Sometimes God lets the conditions become so humanly unfavorable that when He moves, no one can confuse it with luck. Sometimes the soaking is part of the setup. Then Elijah prays. Notice the contrast. No frenzy, no self-harm, no manipulation, no performance, just a simple prayer directed to the God who hears. Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all this at your word. Answer me, Lord, so these people will know that you are turning their hearts back. Then fire falls, not symbolic fire, not vague emotion, real consuming fire. It burns the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, even the water in the trench. Total answer, total exposure, total clarity, and the people fall on their faces. The Lord. He is God, the Lord, He is God. This is the moment everyone would have called the victory. This is the kind of story believers love to celebrate. This is the kind of outcome people imagine will fix everything. A public triumph, an undeniable miracle, a nation brought to its knees. False prophets exposed, heaven answering without ambiguity. Then Elijah tells Ahab the rain is coming. He goes to the top of Carmel, bows low, prays, sends his servant again and again to look toward the sea. At first, nothing, then eventually a small cloud appears, like a man's hand. Soon the sky grows dark with clouds, wind rises, rain comes, and for a brief moment it seems like everything is finally turning. Fire has fallen, rain has returned. Surely now the story changes. Surely now the courage, the prayer, the confrontation, the obedience, all of it has finally shifted the nation. Then Jezebel sends a message, not an army, not a battlefield. A message by this time tomorrow, she says, Elijah will be dead. And Elijah runs. That part shocks many readers because they expect a man who has just stood against hundreds to feel untouchable. But human beings are not machines. Even the strongest servant of God can reach a point where one more threat lands on a soul already carrying too much. You have to understand what may have been happening beneath the surface. Elijah had spent years carrying pressure, years of drought, years of confrontation, years of hiddenness, years of being the visible prophetic voice in a spiritually broken nation. Years of tension between what God had shown and what Israel had become. Then came Carmel, and perhaps somewhere inside him, maybe without even fully admitting it, Elijah hoped this would be the turning point. Maybe now the people would truly return. Maybe now Jezebel's power would break. Maybe now the victory would produce the transformation. Maybe now all the lonely obedience would make visible sense. But one threat from Jezebel reveals something devastating. The mountain did not end the conflict. The fire did not instantly transform the nation. The miracle did not erase resistance. The public victory did not remove private exhaustion. And that is where many people break, not because God failed to move, because they secretly hope that once He moved, the pain would stop making demands on them. Maybe that is where you are. Maybe you have been faithful. Maybe you have seen enough of God's hand to know He is real. Maybe you have obeyed even when it cost you. Maybe you have prayed until heaven answered in some undeniable way. But the battle did not end. The pressure returned. The threat remained. The people around you still did not become who you hoped they would become. The relationship still hurts. The door is still closed. The healing is still incomplete. The environment is still heavy. And now you are dealing with a kind of exhaustion you do not know how to explain, because on paper you should feel triumphant, but in your soul you feel fragile. Elijah leaves his servant, goes a day's journey into the wilderness, sits down under a broom tree, and asks God to take his life. It is enough. That line carries so much. It is enough. I cannot keep doing this. I cannot keep carrying this weight. I cannot keep living between visible power and ongoing pain. I cannot keep being the one who stands when everything still feels unresolved. Then he says something even more revealing. I am no better than my fathers. This is not random self-pity. This is the language of disappointment. It sounds like a man who has reached the end of what he thought his obedience might accomplish. A man who feels like, despite all the fire and all the prayer and all the confrontation, nothing fundamental has changed enough. A man who looks at himself and says, I have not altered the pattern. I have not produced what I hoped. I am not the exception. I am still just as limited as those before me. This is deeper than fear. Fear may have started the running, but despair is what settled under the tree. And that matters because many believers misread this moment. They think Elijah simply got scared. He was scared, but that is not the whole thing. He was emptied. There is a difference. Fear says, something dangerous is in front of me. Despair says, nothing meaningful is left in me. And when a person reaches that point, they do not need a lecture. They need care. This is one of the most tender parts of the whole story. God does not answer Elijah's despair with rebuke. He does not immediately correct his theology. He does not begin with a sermon about faith, courage, or responsibility. He lets him sleep, then an angel wakes him and gives him bread and water. Elijah eats, drinks, lies down again. The angel comes back, touches him again, tells him to rise and eat because the journey is too great for him. That line is so kind. The journey is too great for you, not, why are you so weak? Not, why are you acting like this after all I have done? Not, get yourself together. The journey is too great for you. God acknowledges the limit. He acknowledges the burden. He acknowledges that Elijah is not merely being dramatic. He is depleted, and the first thing heaven gives him is not explanation. It is nourishment that speaks to many people more than they realize. Because some of what you are calling spiritual failure may actually be exhaustion. Some of what you are calling weakness may be the effect of carrying too much for too long without rest. Some of what you are calling distance from God may be happening in a body and mind that are depleted enough to distort your interpretation of everything. God is not simplistic about his servants. He made the body too. He knows the soul is not detached from human frailty. He knows there are moments when bread and sleep are not small things. They are mercy. This does not mean Elijah's problem was only physical. It was deeper than that, but God begins there because you cannot always hear clearly when you are collapsing. Sometimes the holiest thing God gives you first is pause. A quiet room, a moment to breathe, something warm for the body, something soft for the nervous system, a slowing down before the deeper conversation begins. And maybe some of you need permission for that, not permission to give up, permission to stop pretending you are limitless. You do not have to prove your devotion by destroying yourself. You do not have to call burnout spiritual maturity. You do not have to keep acting as though collapse is faithfulness. God is not glorified by your denial of your humanity. He made your limits. He is not offended by them, strengthened by the food. Elijah travels 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. That journey itself says something. Elijah is moving toward a place of encounter, toward memory, toward covenant ground, toward the mountain associated with Moses, with revelation, with God's dealings with his people. Then he enters a cave, from palace confrontation to wilderness collapse to cave silence. What a descent! The man of fire is now hidden in stone. And there the word of the Lord comes to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? It is not a question because God lacks information. It is an invitation, a gentle opening, a chance for Elijah to say what has been living inside him. And Elijah pours it out. He says he has been zealous for the Lord, that Israel has forsaken the covenant, that the altars have been torn down, that the prophets have been killed, and that he is the only one left. Now they want his life too. Listen to the loneliness in that. I only am left. That is not just a statement of external circumstance. It is the language of emotional isolation. It is the cry of someone who no longer sees the wider story because pain has narrowed his field of vision. It is what exhaustion often does. It makes the burden feel singular. It makes you believe no one understands. It makes you believe the entire weight is on your shoulders. It makes you interpret your pain as proof that you are abandoned in it. And maybe that lie has been whispering to you too. You are the only one carrying this. You are the only one still trying. You are the only one staying faithful. You are the only one who sees how bad this really is. No one else understands your interior battle. No one else knows how tired you are. No one else remains. Isolation can make a true burden feel like an ultimate burden. And that is dangerous, because once you believe you are alone in a way, God has not said you are alone. You start carrying what was never meant to sit entirely on your back. You start confusing your calling with omniscience. You start imagining that if you cannot see the rest of God's work, then the rest of God's work does not exist. Then God tells Elijah to stand on the mountain because the Lord is about to pass by. And what follows is unforgettable. A great wind tears through the mountains, breaking rocks apart. But the Lord is not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord is not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire. And surely, if anyone would expect God in the fire, it would be Elijah. Fire is what he knows. Fire is what answered on Carmel. Fire is the dramatic manifestation associated with some of his greatest moments of ministry. But the Lord is not in the fire. Then comes a low whisper, a gentle sound, a stillness carrying presence, and when Elijah hears it, he covers his face and steps out. This is one of the most important moments in the whole story, because God is not only teaching Elijah about how he appears, he is teaching him how to survive the kind of season fire cannot carry. Elijah had known God in confrontation, in drought, in ravens, in miraculous provision, in resurrection, in public fire, in returning rain, but now he must know God in quietness. The Lord, who had answered in dramatic power, had not disappeared when the dramatic power was no longer the dominant experience. He was still present, still speaking, still near, only now he was addressing a servant whose soul needed gentleness more than spectacle. And maybe that is the shift some of you need most. You are waiting for wind, waiting for earthquake, waiting for fire, waiting for some unmistakable moment that will flood your whole life with immediate clarity. And God may do that, he can, but sometimes the deeper restoration comes in whisper form. Not because he is absent, because you are now in a season where his work is subtle enough to heal what noise cannot touch. Some things in us only open in stillness. Some forms of strength only grow in hiddenness. Some kinds of intimacy are impossible when we only know how to recognize God in the spectacular. The whisper does not mean less power. It often means more precision. Fire can expose and alter. A whisper can restore a heart. Wind can shatter rock. A whisper can reach the places in you that broke quietly over time. Earthquake can move the ground. A whisper can steady a soul. And perhaps that is what God was doing with Elijah. Not replacing power with weakness, but revealing that his servant could not live forever on dramatic encounters alone. He needed deeper knowing, a quieter certainty, a relationship with God that remained intact even when heaven was not shouting. Then God asks the question again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah gives the same answer. That detail is so human. One encounter does not always erase the pain immediately. One whisper does not instantly reorganize the emotions. One moment of God's presence does not always make a wounded servant suddenly speak new language. Elijah is still Elijah, still carrying the same grief, still feeling the same loneliness, still convinced he is the only one left. That is important because healing is not always instantaneous in its emotional expression. Sometimes God reveals himself before your feelings fully catch up. Sometimes the truth arrives before your nervous system learns how to rest in it. Sometimes the whisper comes first, and the reorientation unfolds after. This time, God answers Elijah not by debating every feeling, one by one, but by giving him assignment. Go, anoint Hazael king over Syria, anoint Jehu king over Israel, anoint Elisha as prophet in your place. What is God doing there? He is reintroducing Elijah to the fact that the story is still moving. Despair narrows time. It makes you feel like everything has stopped at the point of pain. But God responds with future, with movement, with unfolding purpose, with names Elijah does not control and outcomes Elijah does not have to manufacture. He is reminding his prophet that history is larger than the moment under the broom tree, larger than Jezebel's threat, larger than Elijah's exhaustion, larger than one visible servant's emotional limit. The kingdom of God is not held together by the nervous system of one exhausted prophet. You need to hear that the call on your life is real, your obedience matters, your faithfulness is precious, but you are not the sustaining center of the whole story. God is, and that is not meant to diminish you. It is meant to free you. You do not have to hold everything. You do not have to see everything. You do not have to complete everything alone. You do not have to carry the future of every person you love on your back. You do not have to force the timing of God with the pressure of your fear. Then God says something that breaks Elijah's illusion of aloneness. There are 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal. 7,000 Elijah thought he was alone, not merely outnumbered. Alone, but hidden all through the land were people God had preserved. People Elijah could not see, people not standing on Carmel, not calling down fire, not confronting kings in public view, and yet they remained faithful. What a correction! Not a cruel correction. A merciful one, because God is showing Elijah that his work is always larger than what one tired servant can perceive. And this is where so many weary people need their thinking healed. You think because you cannot see movement, there is no movement. You think because no one around you seems to understand, no one else exists who is staying faithful. You think because the breakthrough is not visible, God must not be building anything. You think because your circle is small and your burden is heavy, heaven's work has narrowed down to your strength. But you do not know what God is preserving out of your sight. You do not know the prayers he is sustaining in hidden rooms. You do not know the quiet obedience happening in people you have never met. You do not know the remnant. You do not know how many knees have not bowed. You do not know how many hearts God is keeping alive, while all you can see is the noise of those who did. That does not minimize your pain. It expands your horizon. You are not abandoned in a universe where evil has taken everything. You are living inside a story where God still has people, still has plans, still has timing, still has untouched territory, still has preserved faithfulness beyond your present field of vision. And then Elijah is told to find Elisha. He finds him plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. Again, the next piece of God's answer is deeply human. Not just cosmic revelation, relationship, succession, shared calling. Elijah throws his cloak over Elisha. That is the invitation. And Elisha responds decisively. He says goodbye to his parents. He sacrifices the oxen, burns the equipment, feeds the people, then follows Elijah. He does not leave himself an easy way back. That is powerful. The exhausted prophet who thought the story ended with him now finds out the next servant is already in the field. God had future prepared before Elijah reached the cave. Let that settle in your spirit before you reached your breaking point. God had already prepared what comes after it. Before you ran into the wilderness, He had not lost a thread. Before you felt your strength thinning, He had not forgotten succession, continuity, extension, legacy. He is never improvising in panic. Elijah was not the final line. He was part of a line, and sometimes what you call failure is actually transition. Sometimes what feels like collapse is God loosening your grip on the illusion that everything depends on you. Sometimes the whisper is not only comfort, it is recalibration. The ministry of Elijah continues, but it is no longer framed by the same illusion of solitary centrality. He moves forward with fresh instruction, with the knowledge of hidden remnant, with the awareness that God's purposes extend beyond his emotional sightline. With a successor beside him, and eventually, Elijah's story ends not in disgrace, not under the broom tree, not in the cave, not in Jezebel's threat, but in glory. He is taken up in a whirlwind. The man who once asked to die is carried home by God in one of the most dramatic departures in Scripture. That contrast is stunning. The prophet who begged for life to end under a tree is not defined by that moment forever. His lowest emotional point is not his final identity. His despair is recorded, but it is not the conclusion. His collapse was real, but it was not ultimate. Some of you need to hear that very plainly. Your lowest moment is not your final definition. The season where you felt the most broken is not the truest thing about your life. The chapter where you wanted to disappear is not the whole story God is writing. The day you sat under your own version of a broom tree and thought, "I cannot do this anymore," did not cancel what heaven still intends to do through you and in you. And even more than that, Elijah appears again later. On the Mount of Transfiguration, centuries after Carmel, centuries after the cave, centuries after the wilderness, he stands there with Moses in the presence of Jesus, still part of the story, still honored in the purposes of God, still remembered not by his collapse, but by the calling God carried through every frail place in him. So what does Elijah's story say to you tonight, or this morning, or in whatever quiet hour you are hearing this? It says that great faith does not cancel human limits. It says dramatic victory does not always remove deep exhaustion. It says you can be brave in public and broken in private, and God will still meet you. It says your despair does not frighten him, your fatigue does not confuse him, your need for sleep, bread, and silence does not disqualify you. It says the whisper matters as much as the fire, maybe more in certain seasons. It says the work of God is larger than your field of vision, larger than your timeline, larger than the few outcomes you can currently measure, larger than the threat that is making your heart race. It says you are not as alone as pain has told you that you are. It says there are 7,000 you cannot see. There are obediences you do not know about. There are futures already in motion. There are successors already in fields. There are provisions already appointed. There are mercies already on the road while you are still under the tree. And perhaps most importantly, it says this: God does not only use strong people. He cares for tired people, not as an afterthought, as part of his holy way. He does not merely command the weary onward, he often feeds them first. He does not merely instruct the broken, he sits with them in the place where their strength gave out and begins again from there. Maybe that is what this season has been about more than you realized. Maybe the silence was not heaven stepping away. Maybe it was God refusing to compete with the noise long enough for you to hear him differently. Maybe the delay was not denial. Maybe it was the slow work of disconnecting your heart from the need for constant spectacle. Maybe the closed door was not rejection. Maybe it was mercy, because you were more tired than you knew, and what you were asking for would have crushed a soul that had not yet been rested. Maybe the hidden season was not wasted. Maybe it was Cherith. Maybe it was Zarephath. Maybe it was Horeb. Maybe it was the place where your public calling could no longer outrun your private need for God. And maybe what hurts most right now is not proof that your life is off course. Maybe it is proof that God is dealing with you in a way too deep to rush. You may still wish He would answer with fire. You may still long for the kind of breakthrough that leaves no room for ambiguity. You may still be tired of subtlety, tired of process, tired of daily bread instead of sudden abundance, tired of whisper seasons when your heart wants thunder. That longing is understandable, but do not miss Him because He is quieter than you expected. Do not call His whisper absence. Do not call His gentleness distance. Do not call His hiddenness indifference. Do not assume that because your season lacks spectacle, it lacks God. Some of His deepest work is done where no crowd can applaud it. Some of His holiest rebuilding happens beneath the level of visible success. Some of His strongest servants are not the ones currently standing on mountains and firelight. They are the ones being sustained in ravines, taught in widows' homes, healed in caves, and redirected by whispers. And if that is you, then hear this clearly. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not disqualified because you are tired. You are not faithless because the journey has felt too great for you. You are not abandoned because you cannot currently see the 7,000. You are not failing because the fire moment did not fix everything. You are not weak because you need bread before answers. You are human, you are seen, and God is still writing. The story is not over where it went quiet. The silence was not the ending. The wilderness was not the ending. The broom tree was not the ending. The cave was not the ending. And your lowest day will not be your ending either. So maybe today you do not need to force yourself into some loud expression of strength. Maybe today you need to let God meet you where Elijah was met. In the need, in the fatigue, in the truth, in the place where you are honest enough to stop pretending. Maybe today your prayer is not a triumphant speech. Maybe it is only this: Lord, I am tired. Feed me, steady me. Speak to me in the way I can hear you now. That prayer is not too small. The God of Elijah knows how to answer that kind of prayer. He knows how to send bread before explanation. He knows how to send rest before instruction. He knows how to send whisper before assignment. He knows how to remind a weary heart that the kingdom is still moving even when the soul feels stalled. And if you stay with Him here, long enough to hear the whisper instead of only demanding the fire, you may discover that this season was not empty at all. It was forming a faith that no longer depends on spectacle to survive. It was healing an inner place that victory alone could not heal. It was teaching you that God is not only the Lord of the mountain. He is the God of the ravine, the widow's house, the desert tree, the cave, and the quiet place where your strength finally admitted it was not enough. And strangely, that is not the end of hope. That is where deeper hope begins, because once you learn that God is still God in the whisper, then silence loses some of its power to terrify you. Delay loses some of its power to define you. Closed doors lose some of their power to shame you. Exhaustion loses some of its power to make you think your calling is gone. You begin to understand that what feels hidden may still be holy. What feels buried may still be becoming. What feels late may still be perfect in the hands of God. So do not leave this season too early in your heart. Do not run from the quiet just because it does not feel like Carmel. Do not despise the bread. Do not minimize the whisper. Do not assume the remnant is gone because you cannot see them. Do not assume the next chapter is unwritten because you have not found Elisha yet. God knows where every part of the story is. He knows the kings. He knows the remnant. He knows the next servant in the field. He knows the timing of rain. He knows how much your soul can carry. He knows what has exhausted you. He knows what has frightened you. He knows what you thought the miracle would change. He knows what still aches in you after the victory. And he is not stepping back from any of it. He is still near, still speaking, still sustaining, still working in places that will only make sense later. And one day you may look back at this quiet, aching, confusing stretch and realize that what you called the end was actually the place where God taught you to know him more truly than before. Not only as the God who sends fire, but as the God who stays when the fire is gone. Not only as the God who answers in power, but as the God who heals in whispers. Not only as the God who uses you, but as the God who gently loves you while you are still tired. If this is where you are right now, then let this settle deep in you. The Lord has not left you in the silence. The journey being too great for you does not mean it is too great for him. The fact that you are weary does not mean your story is finished. And the place where you nearly gave up may become the very place where you finally learn how deeply held you have been all along. So breathe. Eat the bread God is giving in this season. Receive the quiet mercy. Let your soul come out of performance. Let God be gentle with you. Let him redefine what strength looks like. Let him show you that his presence is not measured by volume. And stay close long enough to hear the whisper, because the whisper may change the meaning of your whole season. If this spoke directly to where you are, write "I'm still trusting" in the comments. And if you know someone who is tired of waiting, tired of fighting, or tired of trying to stay strong, send this to them. Sometimes one quiet word at the right moment can keep a weary heart from giving up. And maybe this is that word for you. You were never abandoned in the silence. You are being carried through it.